Hello, I'm Frances Deegan Horowitz, President of the City University Graduate Center. Welcome to Women, a series of programs for and about us. This is a pivotal time in our city with questions about how we should grow and where and how we envision New York in the future. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Julia Vitello-Martin, who is Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and Director of the Center for Rethinking Development. She's here to provide us with a roadmap for thinking about these issues. Thank you. You started out as a political scientist and took your PhD at the University of Chicago. Why?
Well, Chicago, I was a child of the 60s politically, and Chicago was a very exciting place. The University of Chicago itself was very exciting. It was a hotbed of conservatives and liberals all in one place. So it had the Straussians who studied the ancients.
Levi Strauss.
Leo Strauss.
Leo Strauss.
Right. The ancients and to a lesser extent the moderns, but among the moderns the Federalist Papers. And it had fabulous young political scientists like Ted Lowy, who's now at Cornell. And Chicago was a wonderful place to study political science because they did what almost nobody does. They combined ancient philosophy with modern political thought, and they included cities in their modern political thought.
Huh. And when, after you finished your PhD, did you come to New York?
I came to New York. Actually, I came to New York because our friend Donna Shalala, who later, of course, ended up as president of Hunter College, had said to my husband and me, who were marooned in Southern California at the time, that New York was where we should come. And Donna had said, this was 1973 and the job market was very bad, and Donna had said to me, I can't guarantee you a job, but I'll guarantee you 10 job interviews, which she managed to get me. And so I came to New York. My husband went to Columbia, and I took a job teaching in the Department of Urban Policy, now the Milano School, at the New School.
But you didn't stay in the academy very long.
No, because the academy was a little, the academy was a lot of fun, but it was a little slow, given that New York was going through the throes of its fiscal crisis. And so the action, I thought, was elsewhere. So I started writing about the fiscal crisis and left the New School and started a small consulting firm. We called it Metroconomy. And I wrote about and consulted on all sorts of different city things.
But you did a stint at the Vera Institute?
Vera came later. In between, I did a couple of things. I was head of policy and planning at the Parks Department, which was great fun. And I wrote the report called New York Ascendant, which was the report to Mayor Koch on the year 2000. It was chaired by, the commission was chaired by my friend Bobby Wagner. And I did that for a couple of years. That was great fun. And then I ended up at Vera, which is a criminal justice think tank, in the mid-90s.
Looking back in writing something about the year 2000 and then living through the year 2000, how much of that came to be?
Well, we were incredibly right. This report was written in 1986, and actually right before, not long before the stock market crash. And our first line, our first sentence in the report was, "Ours is a time of New York ascendant," which I thought was a little hokey, but we needed a first line, and actually Bobby loved the line, so it stayed in. But the point of the report was that New York had quite a few problems, but it was in for great times, and that, in other words, we anticipated the 1990s, the late 1990s. And one of the major themes of the report was that New York had to overcome its quality of life issues. So the commission, which was made up of a lot of renowned New Yorkers, including Donna and Dick Netzer at NYU and Peter Goldmark, who was president of the Rockefeller Foundation, and many others, the report said we have to do something about New York being dirty and rude and being an unpleasant place for visitors, and that if we can, and petty crime. And we named a number of things which we saw as New York's weaknesses, and they really became the agenda for the Giuliani mayoralty.
And then how did you get to the Manhattan Institute?
Actually, I guess in recounting what I did, I left out an important job. I had been, in the early 1980s, head of the Citizens Housing and Planning Council, which is an old-time, wonderful, good government group. It had been started in the 1930s to push for good housing for all New Yorkers. And I had done that for several years in the 1980s. And boy, it was a hard time to write about housing and development in New York, because New York was much more divided politically than it is now. And every project that came up was opposed. I remember writing a piece for the New York Times. I called it, I think it was called Gridlock, Planning Gridlock or Housing Gridlock. And I used as an example the Towers Nursing Home on Central Park West, you know, that fabulous turn of the century, like crazy Victorian building, all sorts of turrets. And I think I wrote the piece in 1984. And I said, you know, the neighborhood is fighting about this nursing home and what should be done with it. And a pretty good developer owned it at the time. And I said, if the neighborhood doesn't stop fighting about this and other projects, these things are just going to deteriorate further and fall down, and nobody wants that. Well, I was attacked by everybody for this piece, including the neighborhood groups that were opposing the redevelopment of the Towers Nursing Home. And everyone said to me, of course this project's going to get rehabilitated. Well, it didn't get rehabilitated until 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. And in the meantime, the roof fell in. There were many fires. You know, the whole building was open to nature. Snowstorms, rainstorms, pigeons, and now it's being it's going to shortly be opened as a housing development. There's a tower going behind it. In fact, in my opinion, the original development would have been a better development than what's going up now, and would have been much closer to what the neighborhood wanted, because now the neighborhood is getting you know, not that attractive a tower behind this beautiful nursing home. So I'm now doing much of the same work for the Manhattan Institute in 2004, about to be 2005, that I did for Citizens Housing in the early 1980s, but the political climate has completely changed.
In what way?
Well, New Yorkers understand now in a way that they certainly didn't in the 1970s and were beginning to in the 1980s, that we need a very strong tax base if we're going to have the city we want, which is, you know, a vibrant, fabulous, happy city where a lot of people want to come here to work and to live. We need a tax base, and if we don't have that, we can't do the things that many New Yorkers think the city should be doing. We can't provide good public services, can't have good schools, can't keep the city safe. And the best way to get a good tax base is to have a very strong economy and a very strong real estate market, and that means development.
And so is that the genesis for this Center for Rethinking Development?
Yes, the idea behind the Center for Rethinking Development is that had I said this, had it been what I'm about to say, had I said this in the 1980s, I surely would have been simply shouted off the program. But the idea behind the Center for Rethinking Development is that development is good. It's a good thing to have, it's good for New York, it's good for New Yorkers. That doesn't mean that every project is good. But it does mean that development is a good thing to have, the way excellent schools are a good thing to have, and good police service is a good thing to have. Development's good.
But isn't the argument more not whether development is good or bad, but what the effects of development are
Yes,
on our diverse
yes,
population.
Completely right. And actually, that could get us into the issue of affordable housing and inclusionary zoning, if you like. Yes,
I would like.
You would like. Okay, good. Yes. There's an idea in zoning that doesn't much get talked about anymore, but is fundamental to a lot of the arguments about development today. And that's the idea of mitigation. When a development needs rezoning to go forward, the local government, the city, can ask the developer to mitigate any bad effects of the development. And the idea being that the rezoning is going to give the developer substantially more wealth than he had before, and that in exchange for this new wealth, he should pay to mitigate bad effects of the development. So, a familiar example is the Trump development on the west side, on the old rail yards. Actually, it's not the Trump development, it's owned by the Chinese, but everybody calls it the Trump development instead of the Chinese development. Anyway, when that development went up, and that's one of those developments, I think that was a Trump-like development was first proposed in the Wagner administration for that property. And in the second Koch administration, there were a group of Argentinians in like 1982 who wanted to develop it. And finally, it's only just nearing completion now under the Chinese. Anyway, when that development was negotiated in the early 1990s, the Dinkins administration, the developers agreed to mitigate some of the effects of the development by doing parks, rehabilitating some parks, building a fabulous new one, and fixing up, rehabilitating, extending the 72nd Street subway station. So that's obvious, right? You're going to put a lot of people into a new neighborhood, all sorts of people who weren't there before. These people are going to have an effect on the environment. You mitigate, right? But out of this idea of mitigation has come what's a very popular idea now, one of the major methods of providing affordable housing. It's something called inclusionary zoning. And the idea behind inclusionary zoning is that one of the bad effects of market rate development is that it drives up property values, and in driving up property values makes housing more expensive for everybody and less affordable. So housing advocates have been arguing that we should have a form of what's called inclusionary zoning. Instead of excluding lower income people, we include them by mandating in the zoning code that every luxury development include some affordable units. And that's really the big affordable housing development argument today. The Hudson Yards development that you wanted to talk about on the west side is a very good example. At City Council hearings the other day, advocates had come forward and said, well, we don't want this development because it doesn't have enough affordable housing under the zoning code.
But there's the issue of low-income housing, but there's also the issue of middle-income housing.
Quite right.
And so many people, middle income, and even almost close to upper middle income, are really being priced out of the housing market, particularly in Manhattan, but all over the city.
All over the city, yes, that's completely right.
And what powers does government have to mitigate that problem?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked. One of the first things that New York has to do is bring down the housing costs, bring down the cost of construction. The costs of construction in New York are astronomical. New York is the undisputed holder of the building cost construction heavyweight title of the country. We have higher building costs here than any place else by huge amounts. And we have very high costs for many reasons, but a big one is we have a building code that imposes higher costs here than any place else. So we put ourselves at a competitive disadvantage.
Many people think of the building code if they think of it at all, as something that, quote, protects them in terms of safety and insurance that shoddy materials are not going to be used in building and subsequent collapse. So how does the building code address that and yet reduce the cost?
Well, first of all, New York's building code is, I couldn't have dragged it here. It's over 700 pages. It's voluminous, it's idiosyncratic, it doesn't even have an index. It's got subjects addressed in different places, sometimes in a contradictory way. It's almost impossible for one human being to actually know the entire building code. So if we did nothing else but streamline, we'd be doing a great service. But in addition, the building code simply forbids things that we should have. You brought up the question of middle-income housing. One of the finest producers of moderate and middle-income housing in New York over the last few years has been the New York City Housing Partnership, which built multifamily townhouses in all sorts of areas of the city. I mean, did other things too, but now these townhouses are very attractive, and the partnership kept its costs down by doing something that in fact is forbidden by the New York City's building code. It used modular components, and it did that by managing to get its projects under the jurisdiction of the New York State building code, which permits modular components.
And why would New York City's building code prohibit modular components?
Well, primarily for union reasons, because the code forbids the much cheaper system of construction, off-site construction, by which you then, you build these things in, say, Pennsylvania, and then you bring them to the site and you do minimal construction on site. And the building code, which is supported by the unions, encourages on-site construction and virtually forbids off-site construction. There are a few exceptions.
But aren't there jobs once the modular unit gets here?
There are a few, but they're far less extensive. When the City Council recently held very important hearings on this issue of the city adopting the International Building Code, which is a streamlined and very sophisticated code that is now used in 45 states, but not here. The unions, particularly the plumbers, lined up at 6:30 in the morning on the streets around City Hall so that they could get into the hearing and essentially keep anybody else from testifying. When I left at 5, the plumbers were still testifying and nobody else had testified.
But is there any mitigation? If people are looking at losing jobs, they're going to be ferocious in opposing something.
Well, it's funny about these things. They are going to be ferocious about opposing these things. There are an awful lot of construction jobs in New York right now. New York is booming. And New York has many developments that are in the pipeline. And the restriction on the building codes is a restriction on additional buildings. So these things are very circular. And each of the individual unions try to hold on to their privileges. It's in the interest of the City of New York to reform this code, which will in turn produce additional jobs by producing additional development. It may not produce precisely the jobs that the individuals who are now holding jobs want. For example, a big dispute in the code has to do with plastic piping, which the plumbers oppose. But were we to adopt the International Building Code, construction in this city would without question be faster, simpler, and cheaper.
And more?
And more, yes.
So that the net loss of job, would be job loss neutral?
I'd be hesitant to say it's job loss neutral. I think it'd be job loss neutral overall, but it wouldn't necessarily be job loss neutral for those who now have very high-paid union jobs.
But is there a way to address that by retraining, assuring people that they would have, I mean, when people look at the possibility of losing their income?
Well, in fact, in New York, I mean, one of the reasons the unions are agitated about a lot of these issues is the long-term trend has, without question, been in the direction of non-union labor in construction, because, there's a substantial amount of what's called feather bedding in union construction jobs, a lot of high-paid jobs that aren't necessary. So an increasing number of developers have moved to non-union labor, which is another issue.
That's a big issue. West Side development, very controversial. It's tied up with the Jets Stadium.
Right, we're talking about Hudson Yards.
The Hudson Yards development.
Very controversial. Yes.
Very controversial. Yeah. From a long-term planning standpoint, what are the pluses and minuses?
Well, that particular project's not my kind of project because, I think I actually agree with most of the advocates on this. It's too big, it's too ambitious. That stadium is a humongous stadium that doesn't seem to have a very good relationship with the river or the waterfront. But that being said, that section of the West Side needs some kind of major rethinking over what it's got now. The Bloomberg administration proposed this. Many other groups are out there counter-proposing another set of ideas. It seems to me very unlikely we're going to get the precise configurations that the Bloomberg administration has put forward, but that we will get and we should get substantial commercial and residential development on the site. I think the stadium's probably not going to go. And I actually personally won't mourn the loss of the stadium. I'm a great fan of that stadium in San Francisco, that marvelous baseball stadium, which is right on the water. And it's just such a friendly, wonderful stadium. And it has done what the Bloomberg administration hopes this stadium will do. It spurred development in what had been a very derelict area of San Francisco. I mean, it's hard to imagine. In fact, that area is so vibrant and fabulous now, it's hard to imagine it was once every bit as derelict as Hudson Yards. But
so why are you not in favor?
I don't like the Gehry design. I don't like how huge and intimidating it is.
It's hard to have a stadium that's not intimidating.
Well, this stadium in San Francisco is just the friendliest little thing. It's just absolutely adorable, and San Franciscans use the area all the time. It's open to the public. The waterfront's open to the public, and of course there are all those kayakers out there catching Barry Bonds' home runs, and it's just simply fabulous. And this stadium is very aggressive with the water. That stadium's very friendly with the water and very friendly with pedestrians.
So are you saying if you redesign the stadium is okay?
I would be for this if we had a San Francisco-style stadium, yeah.
And you think that's going to happen?
No. No.
What are the other major issues in development in New York City right now?
Well, the Brooklyn waterfront's a big one. It's funny, New Yorkers always think we don't have enough land in New York. And we don't have enough land in prime neighborhoods. But we also have this extraordinary waterfront, something like 578 miles, right? I mean, something astonishing. And most of the waterfront's undeveloped. And it's undeveloped because most of it is zoned inappropriately. It's zoned manufacturing and zoned industrial. And one of the first things the Bloomberg administration did was say there's something wrong here, and they're right. When Bloomberg became mayor, one of his very first initiatives was to rezone the waterfront, the Brooklyn waterfront in particular, to permit housing. And that's going forward. I'm 100% for this. I think it's immensely important to the city, and it's immensely important to those neighborhoods. So there'll be many public hearings on this to come, and there'll be a number of difficult issues to be resolved, but basically the administration's doing the right thing now.
And do you think we are, as your 2000 New York City Ascendant 2000 report was prescient, do you think we're going to really crack the issue of affordable housing in the city?
We're not going to crack the issue of affordable housing without doing something about construction costs, because otherwise we're back in this bind of needing direct subsidies. And direct subsidies are a very hard thing for a local government to provide. I mean, there are only two ways to make housing affordable, right? You provide a subsidy to a family that can't afford it, or you bring down the cost so they can afford it.
Well, Julia, very interesting issues, but I'm sorry we're out of time. My thanks to Dr. Julia Vitello-Martin for joining us. You can learn more about the work of the Center for Rethinking Development and the Manhattan Institute by logging on to the website manhattaninstitute.org. For the City University Graduate Center and Women to Women, I'm Frances Deegan Horowitz.